Hell's Angel spent 3 years in a coma until an orphaned girl did something unexpected. The doctors said he was gone long before his heart ever stopped racing. 3 years without a word, 3 years without a blink. No one expected him to wake up, and no one imagined it would be a small orphaned girl who changed everything. Johnny Angel Monroe had lived most of his life being someone people crossed the street to avoid. He rode hard, he spoke little, and when he looked at you, it felt like he could see right through whatever story you were telling yourself. The patch on his leather jacket meant things. To some, it meant danger. To others, freedom. To Johnny, it was armor. It was easier to be feared than understood. He had grown up in a house where silence followed shouting, where bottles lined the sink like soldiers that had lost their war. He left early, too early. The road raised him more than any person ever did. Motorcycles became his church. The engine was the only sound that ever drowned out his thoughts. At 60 miles an hour, regret couldn't keep up. On the night it happened, the sky was wide and empty. The kind of night that tricks you into believing you're invincible. Johnny pushed the throttle harder than he should have. The road shimmered. An oil patch glistened like a quiet warning no one listens to. The crash wasn't loud for long. Metal screamed, time slowed, and then everything went dark. When Johnny arrived at the hospital, he didn't have a name, just a body full of broken bones and a brain that refused to wake up. The doctors did what they could. Machines breathed for him, tubes fed him, charts filled with words no family member was there to read. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Eventually, the nurses stopped expecting visitors. Some whispered that men like him didn't deserve miracles. Others said he had lived exactly the life he chose, but the truth was quieter. Johnny Angel Monroe lay still in a white room, trapped somewhere deep inside himself, while the world moved on without him. And then, one afternoon, a little girl pressed her hands against the glass of his door and asked a question no one else had bothered to ask. "Is he lonely?" Sophie Hale was 8 years old when her world ended in a flash of headlights and screaming metal. One moment, she was humming in the back seat. The next, everything she knew was gone. The hospital smelled like clean floors and quiet sadness. Adults spoke around her, not to her. Words like accident and no survivors floated through the air like they belonged to someone else's life. By the end of the week, Sophie had a small backpack and nowhere to go. The foster system moved fast, faster than grief, faster than understanding. She learned quickly not to cry where people could see. Tears made adults uncomfortable. When she walked the halls of the hospital daycare, she noticed a room that was always quiet. A man inside, big, still, covered in tattoos like pictures frozen mid-sentence. Something about him felt familiar. Not scary, not angry, just stuck. "Is he sleeping?" Sophie asked one day, pressing her fingers to the glass. The social worker gently pulled her away. "He's very sick, sweetheart." Sophie nodded. She knew what sick looked like. Sick was when someone was still there, but not really. At night, in her foster bed, Sophie dreamed of engines humming and a man who never left. She didn't know why. She only knew she wanted to go back, so she did. During daycare hours, when no one was paying attention, Sophie slipped down the hall and into Johnny's room. She didn't speak at first. She just sat. Quiet company for someone who had too much silence. She brought her stuffed elephant, then her drawings, then her voice. She talked about school lunches she didn't like, about missing her mom's singing, about how grown-ups didn't hug long enough. The machines beeped. Johnny didn't move, but Sophie kept coming, because sometimes when she held his hand it felt warm, and for a girl who had lost everything, warmth meant hope. The nurses noticed her before the doctors did. "She's back again," one whispered. "Does he have family?" another asked. "No, just her." At first they tried to stop Sophie. Hospital rules, safety concerns, liability, but she never touched anything, never unplugged a machine. She only talked, so they let her stay. Sophie began treating Johnny like he was listening, because in her heart she believed he was. She told him about the foster home, about how quiet dinners felt loud when no one spoke, about how bedtime was the hardest because silence reminded her of loss. "I think you understand," she whispered one afternoon. "You're quiet too." She brushed his hand with her small fingers, careful not to disturb the wires. Sometimes she hummed, sometimes she just sat and breathed. 3 years into Johnny's coma, doctors had stopped expecting improvement. His chart read persistent vegetative state, words that sounded final. But Sophie didn't read charts, she read faces. One day she noticed something different, not a movement, not a blink, just something, a feeling she couldn't explain. "You heard that, didn't you?" she asked softly after telling him a story. The machines kept beeping. Still, Sophie smiled. She began visiting every day. What no one knew was that Johnny's mind wasn't empty. It was trapped. Memories floated like fragments of broken glass. Voices echoed. Roads blurred into dreams. And through it all there was a sound, a small voice, gentle, persistent, refusing to leave. Somewhere deep inside the darkness, something stirred. Dr. Harris had seen it all. Gunshot wounds, car crashes, people who refused to wake up. Hope was a dangerous thing in his line of work. "This child is projecting," he told the staff gently. "It's a coping mechanism, but his vitals spike when she's here," a nurse replied quietly. "Coincidence," they said. Still, the data didn't lie. Heart rate changes, brain activity flickers. Small, inconsistent, but knew Johnny's body was responding to something. Sophie, unaware of debates behind closed doors, continued her routine. She talked about birthdays, about how she wished she had a dad who waited for her after school. "You'd be good at it," she told Johnny one day. "You look strong, like someone who would protect." That night, Johnny dreamed. He stood on an open road. The engine was silent. A little girl stood ahead of him, holding out her hand. "Come back," she said. He tried to move. He couldn't. On a rainy afternoon, Sophie arrived holding a folded piece of paper. "I wrote you something," she whispered. It was a letter, messy handwriting, misspelled words, honest thoughts. "I don't have a family anymore, but when I'm here I feel like I do." She placed the letter on his chest and leaned close. "I don't want you to be alone," she said. "Please don't leave." Her tears fell onto his hand. And then the machine beep changed. Just once, the nurse froze. Johnny's finger twitched, barely but undeniably. Sophie gasped. "You did that," she whispered, smiling through tears. Doctors rushed in. Tests were run. Explanations searched for. But no one could explain why, after 3 silent years, Johnny Angel Monroe chose that moment to begin his return. Waking up didn't happen like the movies. There was no sudden gasp, no dramatic sitting up in bed. Johnny came back the way winter leaves, slowly, painfully, 1 degree at a time. At first, it was just his eyes. They opened for seconds, then closed again like they weren't sure the world was worth looking at. Light hurt. Sound confused him. His body felt heavy, like it belonged to someone else. But one thing cut through the fog. A voice. Small, steady, familiar. "You're okay," Sophie whispered, sitting beside him. "You don't have to hurry." Johnny didn't understand where he was or why his chest burned when he breathed. But he understood that voice. Somehow, it felt like a hand reaching down into deep water, refusing to let go. Doctors warned everyone not to expect too much. "Awareness comes and goes," they said. "Regression is common." But Sophie stayed. Every day, she held his hand during physical therapy, even when his fingers wouldn't close around hers. She talked when words tired him. She sat quietly when silence was all he could handle. Johnny cried when he realized he couldn't move his legs properly. He cried when he tried to speak and nothing came out. He cried because his past felt like a locked room he wasn't sure he wanted to open again. Sophie never told him to be brave. She just said, "It's okay to be scared." Weeks passed, then months. Johnny learned how to sit up, how to swallow without choking, how to lift a spoon that felt heavier than any motorcycle he'd ever ridden. One afternoon, his lips moved. A sound escaped, not a word, just breath shaped like meaning. Sophie leaned in, heart pounding. "Say it again," she whispered. Johnny focused with everything he had left. "S.O." She froze. "Sophie," the nurse asked gently. Johnny nodded. Tears streamed down his face. That was the moment everyone stopped calling him a miracle case and started calling him a father in the making. As Johnny grew stronger, memories returned like uninvited guests. Some came soft, open roads, wind against his face, laughter that didn't last long. Others arrived sharp and heavy, dragging guilt behind them like chains. He remembered fights, bars, faces he couldn't name but knew he'd hurt. He remembered choosing speed over stillness, noise over feeling. One afternoon, while sitting in his wheelchair by the window, he finally asked the question he'd been avoiding. "What kind of man was I?" he asked Sophie. She thought for a moment. "Scary," she said honestly, then added, "but lonely." Johnny let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. Doctors filled him in on the rest. His motorcycle was gone. His club had moved on. No one had come looking for him. Surprisingly, it didn't hurt. because for the first time in his life, something was asking him to stay. Sophie brought him drawings of houses with chimneys and dogs and two people holding hands. She talked about school, about wanting to learn how to ride a bike someday. "You could teach me," she said casually. Johnny smiled, unsure if his heart could survive that sentence. Then the social worker returned. Paperwork, assessment, questions. Sophie was still in foster care, still moving, still temporary. That night Johnny didn't sleep. He stared at the ceiling and understood something clearly for the first time. He hadn't been spared for no reason. The next morning, when the social worker asked if he needed anything, Johnny didn't hesitate. "I want to adopt her," he said. The room went silent. The word no arrived gently, wrapped in professional smiles and careful language. "Your recovery is still ongoing. Your history raises concerns. Children need stability." Johnny listened without interrupting. Sophie sat beside him, swinging her feet, not fully understanding yet. Later, when they were alone, she looked up at him. "They don't think you're ready," she said. Johnny nodded. "They might be right." That night, Sophie cried quietly into her pillow at the foster home. Johnny stared at his reflection in the hospital bathroom mirror. For the first time, fear wasn't about dying. It was about losing someone who had already changed his life. He enrolled in parenting classes, counseling, trauma therapy, anger management. Every requirement they gave him, he met without complaint. Weeks turned into months. Some days Sophie visited smiling. Other days she was quiet. "You're still my person," she told him once, "even if they say no." Johnny squeezed her hand. Always. Behind closed doors, social workers debated, doctors testified, therapists evaluated. Johnny showed up every time, on time, present, not perfect, but real. Waiting is harder than fighting. Johnny learned that quickly. He waited for letters, for phone calls, for decisions made in rooms he wasn't allowed to enter. Sophie waited too. She packed and unpacked her small backpack more times than she could count. Each move taught her not to get comfortable. One afternoon, she asked Johnny something that broke him. "If they say no, will you forget me?" Johnny pulled her close, careful with his still healing body. "Never," he said, "even if I have to remember you for the rest of my life." The court date was set. The night before, Johnny couldn't sleep. He practiced what he would say, but words felt small compared to the truth. Sophie held his hand. "Whatever happens," she said, "thank you for waking." Paperwork was signed, the judge had spoken, and yet nothing felt finished. Johnny learned quickly that being approved was not the same as being ready. The first night Sophie slept in the small apartment the hospital social worker helped him find, Johnny barely closed his eyes. He sat on the edge of the couch, listening to her breathing through the open bedroom door, afraid that if he slept, everything might disappear. Sophie's room was simple: a bed, a lamp, a few clothes folded neatly in a drawer. Her backpack rested by the wall, still half-packed, out of habit more than need. "You don't have to keep it ready anymore," Johnny told her gently. She nodded but didn't move it. Mornings were awkward at first. Johnny burned toast. Sophie laughed. He apologized too much. She hugged without warning. He froze, then slowly learned how to hug back. There were moments when Johnny felt unqualified for something this fragile. When Sophie had nightmares and cried for parents he could never replace. When school forms asked for mother and father, and Sophie paused before filling them in. Johnny never pretended to be perfect. Instead, he listened. When Sophie got quiet, he sat beside her. When she asked hard questions, he answered honestly. When she pushed him away, he stayed close enough to be found again. One evening, Sophie handed him a crumpled piece of paper. It was a drawing. 2 figures, one tall, one small, a road behind them, a house ahead. "I think this is what staying looks like," she said. Johnny swallowed hard. For the first time in his life, staying didn't feel like a trap. It felt like purpose. Johnny sold the last of his old gear quietly. No ceremony, no goodbye rides, just boxes taped shut and left behind. He kept one thing: a photograph Sophie took of him standing without assistance for the first time. His legs shook. His smile didn't. He found work at a local repair shop. Not motorcycles, cars, steady hours, honest pay, no late nights. The men there didn't know his past, and Johnny didn't offer it. At night, he helped Sophie with homework, learning math again just to keep up with her questions. They cooked dinner together. Sometimes they burned it. Sometimes they ordered pizza and called it a win. Sophie joined a bike club at school. "Training wheels first," Johnny insisted. She rolled her eyes but agreed. There were setbacks. Days when Johnny's body ached so badly he could barely stand. Days when Sophie came home quiet after hearing other kids talk about their parents. On those days, Johnny reminded her and himself that healing wasn't a straight line. "I didn't wake up all at once," he said, "and we don't have to be okay all at once either." Sophie nodded. She understood more than people realized. One night, as Johnny tucked her in, Sophie looked up at him. "You know," she said, "I think you were asleep so you could wake up better." Johnny kissed her forehead. So did he. The past doesn't always stay buried. One afternoon, Johnny spotted a familiar jacket across the street. Same patch, same colors, a man he used to ride with. The man recognized him instantly. "Thought you were dead," he said. Johnny didn't smile. "I was," he replied. The conversation was short, polite, distant. When Johnny returned home, Sophie noticed his hands shaking. "Did something bad happen?" she asked. Johnny sat beside her. "I met someone from my old life," he said honestly. "Do you miss it?" she asked. Johnny thought for a long moment. "No," he said. "I miss who I thought I was, but I like who I am now." That night, Johnny locked the door and double-checked the windows. Not out of fear, out of responsibility. Sophie slept peacefully. That mattered more than anything else. Years passed quietly. Sophie grew taller, louder, braver. Johnny grew steadier, softer, strong in ways he'd never been before. They celebrated small things. Good grades, clean checkups, first bike ride without training wheels. Johnny ran beside her, breath heavy, heart full. When Sophie fell, he didn't rush to lift her. He knelt. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded and stood on her own. Johnny smiled. That night, Sophie hugged him tight. "Thank you for not leaving," she whispered. Johnny held her longer than necessary. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, and he meant it. Johnny still dreamed of roads sometimes, open highways, endless sky. But the dreams no longer pulled him away. They reminded him how far he'd come. One evening, Johnny and Sophie stood outside their home, watching the sun sink low. "Do you ever wish things were different?" Sophie asked. Johnny shook his head. "No," he said, "because then I wouldn't have you." Sophie smiled. Some miracles don't arrive fast. Some wake up slowly. And some come in small voices that refuse.